Good morning. Okay, sorry. Okay, so it's my great privilege to have Professor Luca Maria Pisando with us and joining us for our bi-weekly seminar series. Luca is going to be speaking on childhood exposure to school expansion and changes in intercaste marriage in India. Professor Pasando is an associate professor of social research and public policy at New York University, Abu Dhabi. Before joining NYU, he was an assistant professor of sociology and demography in the Department of Sociology and Center on Population Dynamics at McGill University. His research lies in the areas of social, economic, and digital demography. He is interested in issues of family poverty, inequality, gender, social stratification, intra and intergenerational processes, technology adoption, and interactions between life cycle events and human capital accumulation. His overarching research aim is to produce better knowledge on the link between family change, gender, and educational inequalities in areas where these dynamics are changing rapidly and scant research is available. Without further ado, we would please welcome Professor Pisando. We will save our questions till the end. So if you have questions and would like to share with the group, you are welcome to put it in the chat box or save your questions till the end of the seminar. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I'm actually very pleased to be with you here today. I hope to be able to visit one day. I've never been to Singapore, so I have to be able to visit in person. But this is it's really wonderful, and it's wonderful to see lots of people connected. So yes, this paper is titled Childhood Exposure to School Expansion and Changes in Intercaste Marriage in India. For those of you who know my research a little bit, most of my work is actually on Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. So this is a bit of a new research direction for me. And it's also a relatively recent project. So I think it's actually at the perfect stage to receive feedback and suggestions. Let me start from the very nice team I'm working with. Nitin, he's a postdoc here in economics at NYU Abu Dhabi. Koyel just left. She started a postdoc at Barcelona at the Center for Demographic Studies. And Neha is an assistant professor at Flame University in India. So the overall goal of this project is actually to shed additional light on the reasons why family change is happening more slowly in India. There's quite a lot of knowledge out there on the extent to which family change is occurring or not in the context of India. And most findings seem to suggest that changes in many family domains, such as arranged marriage, delay in marriage, childbearing, seem to be happening slightly lower in the context of India than in many other places. So this is the overall puzzle. Like, is that true? Is that really the case? Should we look at additional dimensions, or should we think about additional policy levers that may sort of break these slow changing family forms? And the paper focuses on intercaste marriage. So that's a relevant area of study for family change in India, because divisions along caste lines remain a very strong defining feature of the Indian society. And one of the key features of the caste system is precisely the closed system of marriage, which is called caste endogamy. What we're going to be looking at today is actually the opposite of caste endogamy. We're going to look at caste intermarriage or intercaste marriage, which I'm going to be using as synonyms here. And the reason why we believe this is important from a sociological standpoint is because intercaste marriages provide a very clear indication of social integration and social mixing. You can think of this as the literature that exists in the US on interracial marriage. It's kind of a pretty similar literature that is a nascent literature here, But it is the case that intercaste marriages, in a similar way to interracial marriages, do provide some sense of whether there is social integration in society, social cohesion, social mixing, intermixing. And this in turn has been shown to correlate heavily with solidarity in society, with social trust, and with dynamics of social mobility. Okay, so this is the overall context that we have in mind, looking at intercaste marriages, looking at what shaped intercaste marriages as one stepping point to analyze dynamics of social mobility in the context of India. So let's start from this graph. Even when it comes to intercaste marriage, most of the knowledge and a bit of rhetoric that exists out there is that intercaste marriage is not really a thing in India. It's not a phenomenon that is happening. It's incredibly low. And it is the case that it's not very highly prevalent. But once you take what I call a marriage perspective, a marriage cohort perspective, we do see some changes in intercaste marriage that occurred between the oldest marriage cohort, 1980 marriage cohort, and the latest marriage cohort, 2016. So what we do observe here is that the percentage of couples that are intercaste couples has increased pretty much by 4.4 percentage points, from 10.4 to about 14.8% in the latest marriage cohort. So it is a 4.4 percentage point increase. It's not huge, but it is something noticeable over the course of 20 years of marriage cohort. And what we try to do here is to understand what may be some of the drivers behind this mild increase in intercaste marriage. And what is the driver that we're looking at? We're going to be looking at educational expansion. Now, I'm going to further qualify educational expansion as the talk goes on, but the reason why this matters in the context of India is because education has expanded massively since independence, since the 1950s. There have been heavy governmental investments and policies to boost enrollment, to boost attendance in primary and secondary school, primarily in primary school, and I will show you a graph that shows that. In 1994, actually, India implemented what is called the District Primary Education Program, which was precisely a governmental scheme to expand, universalize, and transform the quality of primary education in India. So it is the case that in many low and middle income countries, education has expanded, but in India, this has been sort of steadier and much more consistent than in many other low and middle income countries. And this is a graph that provides a sense of what I'm talking about. Keep in mind here, I'm showing you growth in number of schools, irrespective of whether these are primary or secondary schools. And I'll then show you the graph that we made with our own data afterwards. This is taken actually from a newspaper article. But what this shows is that since independence, 1947-48, the number of schools grew more than 10 times, from 140,000 to about 1,500,000. Okay, and pretty steadily, you can see how consistent the growth has been in the growth of schools. So what is the research question? I've sort of introduced it already, but the simple research question we're exploring is, what are the implications of this massive educational expansion for the likelihood that someone marries across castes? Is it the case that schooling is an effective policy lever that may really shape rigid institutions such as marriage in the Indian context and caste endogamy, both of which have been shown to be quite traditional institutions? And we do explore this by making the most of massive school openings. Okay, so we're going to be looking sort of at exogenous shocks in school openings. Then we all know that school openings are not fully exogenous, and I'm trying to tell you what we do to clean the estimates, but we're looking at changes in school openings over time in the past, when the person was a child, and how these massive school openings that people experience in childhood affect intercaste marriage when they're adults. I've mentioned this debate about the sort of the slow effectiveness of modernization processes in India. There's debate here. Many people claim that it's not really true, that actually what we're observing is a hybridization of family forms. It's not really a complete stalling. It's some sort of hybridization whereby some traits of modernization coexist with some traits of traditionalism. And going back to the overall picture, we do really believe that looking at intercaste marriage is a first stepping stone to study intragenerational inequalities, intergenerational inequalities, solidarity, social trust, and so on and so on. And this also really matters in the context of India, because as we all know, as of now, India is the biggest demographic player in the world. So really looking at dynamics of social mobility, social solidarity, social trust in the country that even more so in the future will be the biggest player of the world, is relevant. So contributions to the literature, we believe is threefold. On one hand, the first one could simply be to get a better sense of the extent to which education is related with the likelihood of marrying across castes. There has been some work in this domain, and I'll tell you in a second what this work found. What we do here is to build on this correlational evidence and to try to provide the first causal estimates of exposure to schooling, of the extent to which exposure to schooling affects intercaste marriage. Something else that we believe is an important contribution from a purely demographic perspective is actually to provide updated trends in intercaste marriage. As I've told you, very little work is looking at this, and part of this is a byproduct of the fact that we didn't have good enough data. Now, the recent DHS or NFHS in the context of India came out relatively recently, and that data set really allows us to trace cohorts backwards further in time. So we do believe that also gives us some better estimates of intercaste marriage. And lastly, from a purely economic standpoint, given that some members of our team are economists, this is really one example of how early childhood interventions may have important impacts for demographic and social development outcomes later in time. Okay, so I've shown you the trend in intercaste marriage. Those were trends that I made by across marriage cohorts. Existing evidence is sort of in line with what I mentioned, and also shows very high heterogeneity in the estimates across different Indian states. Some states exhibit a higher prevalence of intercaste marriage, such as Punjab, West Bengal, and Gujarat. Many other states instead have much lower prevalence of intercaste marriage, around 2%, 3%, 1%. So the broad geographic variability. And also some work that exists does suggest that there seems to be a bit of a correlation between the likelihood of marrying across castes and having higher education. So this is a phenomenon that is happening slowly, and it's happening slightly more among educationally and culturally advantaged men and women or couples. And one last piece of work does suggest that indeed, it is the case that with industrialization, modernization, there seems to be a slightly changing norm regarding intercaste marriage, whereby people are more accepting of the practice. So going back to what I was mentioning before, some work has looked at the relationship between levels of education and intercaste marriage, not really in the way that we're looking at, so not quasi-experimentally, but some of this work does suggest that having higher education, especially parents having higher education, are associated with the likelihood that their children marry across castes. So the existing work does suggest that it's not really your own level of education that matters, but it's more the education of the family context in which you grew up. So many studies find that what matters is the education of the mother of the groom. Some other studies suggest that it's the education of the mother of the bride. So there is some discrepancy in there, but there's some homogeneity in the sense of finding that it's not your own education, but it's your parents' education that seems to explain variability in intercaste marriage. Okay, so let's think a little bit about the theoretical channels that may be behind what we're looking at. We're looking at exposure to education as a child and how this may affect your likelihood of marrying across castes as an adult. The channel we have in mind is what we call enlightenment perspective, which many other people call contact theory. So you see here 3 different labels, but these are actually labels that many different disciplines use. They sort of all proxy for the same idea. I think sociologists like the concept of contact theory or the label of contact theory. So that's the one that we're going to be using the most. So the idea here is that schooling, education, being exposed to school really provides you with an opportunity for social mixing, getting to know people from other contexts, interact with people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, and that in turn shapes your own prejudices, attitudes, stereotypes, and makes you more accepting of diversity, of differences. So this is what we have in mind, and you will see that as of now, we have some suggesting evidence that this is happening, but we haven't really pinpointed the actual mechanism yet. So that's precisely where we may need a little bit of your help and suggestions. Okay, let's move to the data. This was I'm not sure if I'm going to give you a sense, but this was a really heavy data work for the reason that I'm going to outline in a second. We're first using couple level data from the DHS, which in the Indian context is called National Family Health Survey. The 2014 wave was already there. The 2019 wave was conducted in 2019, but it was released very recently between 2021 and 2022. So now we're combining these two waves, 2014 and 2019, because we're adopting a marriage cohort perspective. So we are aligning individuals and bringing them back in time to see when these individuals were born. So this is where we obtain information on inter-caste marriage. The DHS provide this information. They provide the information on the caste of the woman and the caste of the man, or the husband and the wife, because these are couple level data. They provide information on year of birth and other individual and household level characteristics that all DHSs typically have. Then what we do here is actually to focus on men. So we're going to be looking at exposure to schooling among male children and how this affects men's likelihood of getting married across castes. The reason why we're mostly focusing on men is because we need to make sure that these individuals have never moved. We're going to be using some spatial approaches. So we need to make sure that the man that we are observing as of now is the same man that was exposed to school openings 20, 25, 15 years ago. Okay, and in the Indian context, women are far more likely to migrate than men. Actually, the DHS suggests that around 85% of men have never moved. So our estimates will be limited to this 85% of men or 87% of men who have never moved in their lives. So focusing on men because of migration reasons, focusing on ages 22 and above, we have some robustness checks for 24, 25 and above. We just want to make sure that these men are done with their basic levels of education. And we're going to be mostly focusing on rural India only, because these are actually some of the contexts that have witnessed some of the most massive school openings and where most of the policies that have been implemented have been targeted towards. So this is the first source of data, DHS. Many of you are familiar with DHS. The second one is what is called the District Information System for Education. You can think of this as being a census of schools. This can be thought of as a census of schools. It provides information on 12 million schools, and it also gives information on the year in which this school opened, the type of school, if it was a private school or a public school, and the kind of level of education that that school provided. Some schools are only primary schools, some others have primary and secondary, some others also have higher. And the information that we leverage from this data set, though, is the information on district and village names. And we use these names of villages to match with the census, with the actual census of the overall population in 1991 and 2001. The reason why we also bring the census into the picture in this analysis is because we need a whole other series of village level characteristics to make sure that school openings are not an endogenous phenomenon here. We need to control for infrastructure of the village, and from the extent to which the village is rural or urban, the kind of prevalence of different castes in the village at the time in which the schools open, and so on and so forth. Now, this seems easy, but actually the very complex aspect of the merging was that these DICE data, so the census of schools, did not provide village level identifiers. They only provided the names of the village. So what we had to do here was to really match name by name, to do fuzzy matching of village names between the DICE data and the census data. And that, of course, is subject to lots of errors. So we did lots of robustness checks, varying the matching rate, 70%, 80%, 90%, to see if our results change or not. Then once we managed to successfully match at least 70% of villages between the DICE data and the census data, we use this combination of data sets to merge with the DHS. You know that the DHS now provide geographical coordinates of each cluster. These coordinates are randomly displaced within a 5-kilometer radius because respondents need to be protected from privacy concerns. And so we created a 5-kilometer radius buffer zone around the coordinates for each village, and we merged these buffer zones with the geographical information from the censuses. The ultimate outcome of all of this is an annual balance panel at the buffer zone of the number of primary schools that opened between 1950 and 2012. Now, this is essential because we need school openings when the man was a child. So we need to really go back in time to make sure that we are capturing the proper school exposure of these men that we observe in the DHS right now. Okay, one example of the merging, this is one example from the Karnataka state of how the merging occurred. You can see in red, the red dots provide the 5-kilometer buffer zones that are obtained from the DHS, and the white shapes provide village boundaries. So you see that the buffer zones captures a series of villages nearby. But this is not really different from any spatial matching that demographers are very used to right now. Okay, what about variables? The outcome is very simple. We have the caste of the husband and the caste of the wife. We build a dummy that is 0 if there is evidence of caste endogamy, so partners marry within caste, and 1 if partners married across castes. So any difference in castes between the partners. And I'll show you now all of the different cells of the contingency table. And instead, the main predictor, so what we arguably believe provides a causal effect, is the change in the number of schools once the husband was between the ages of 0 and 9. So when the husband was a child, but specifically we use the range of ages between 0 and 9 because we're mostly capturing exposure to primary school here. We have robustness checks from 0 to 10 and from 0 to 11 because primary schools doesn't necessarily end at 9. Actually, it ends later on. But here we want it to be conservative. This is also useful because we can then run lots of different placebos. So we can say, okay, let's try to expose this man to school openings after primary school. So when the man was 14 to 19. And if we do that, we really would want to see that that exposure has 0 effect on their likelihood of entering inter-caste marriages. But I'm going to show you all of these different placebos. So one important point, which you see in red on this slide, is that we're not really estimating the total impact of the existence of schools. So we're not looking at the impact of stock of schools on likelihood of inter-caste marriage. We're looking at the impact of opening up of new schools, so changes in the number of schools when the man was a child on the likelihood of marrying across caste, controlling for the existing stock of schools at different ages. Okay, so going back to the data, you remember at the very beginning, I showed you school expansion using a graph that I took from a newspaper article. This is a graph that we made ourselves using our DICE data. So using the census of schools from 1950 to 2015. And you have 2 different quantities here in this graph. You have on the left-hand side, the total number of schools, which is the black line. And you see that that black line very closely resembles the graph that I showed you at the very beginning, sort of a very steady increase in the total number of schools. And then instead you have in orange, the number of schools that open in every single year. Okay, so this is a different quantity. It's not the total number of schools overall, it's every year how many schools open. And what these orange quantities show is that there are many schools open, of course, but since 1994, which is when the district primary education program was implemented, there has been an even more massive increase in the number of primary schools. You see, this is pretty much 1994 onwards. You see that the policy really boosted school openings. Okay, for those of you who are less familiar, including myself, who are less familiar with the Indian context and with the caste classification, you can just here look at the right-hand side of the slide because these are the same names that we're going to use in our analysis. We're going to be looking at 4 different castes, what is called scheduled tribes, which you don't even see here because they're very scattered around India. scheduled caste, which can be considered the bottom of the hierarchy, SC, OBC, other backward classes, OBC, and then upper caste, which in our data are called general caste. Okay, so we have general, OBC, SC, and ST. Again, the ST, which has the scheduled tribes, do not really appear here because, first of all, many people don't think they are part of the caste hierarchy, and second of all, they are really scattered in small chunks throughout India. But we observed them in the data, so we decided to include them. Okay, so let's now look at the inter-caste marriage. Again, you can look at the black line, which is exactly the line that I showed you at the very beginning of this presentation. So this is the increase in inter-caste marriage, which has changed from about 10% to close to 14%. This is only for men. So the analytical sample here are men in rural areas, which is why you see a slightly lower value with respect to the one that I showed you at the beginning. But then what we do here is to disentangle the shares of the percentages, sorry, of inter-caste marriage by the caste group of the husband, okay? So you see here, what you see here is that inter-caste marriage has increased across all different castes of the husband, but we do observe higher levels of inter-caste marriage when the husband belongs to scheduled caste, which is the green line, or when the husband belongs to general caste, which is the red one. So nothing really suggestive here of any specific pattern, because actually the scheduled castes are the lowest caste and the general caste are the higher caste. But we do observe that there is a little bit of variability depending on the caste that the husband belongs to. Okay, now contingency table, which is always a very simple tool when you're looking at couple level variables to see where different couples fall. One very easy way of reading a contingency table is to look at the diagonal. The diagonal always tells you the matches between same categories. You have husband caste here on the top, and you have wife's caste in the columns. And the diagonal tells you what is the percentage of couples where both the husband and the wife belong to the same caste. You see that 88% of couples form between husband and wives, both belonging to scheduled tribes, 83% both belonging to scheduled caste, 89% both belonging to OBC, and 83% both belonging to general. So this does confirm that caste endogamy remains the norm. Like 88%, 89% of individuals marry within the same caste. But it also shows, if you look at the off diagonals, that there are lots of different combinations of castes between partners. Perhaps the most prevalent off-diagonal combination is this one, 12.5%, which is the combination where the husband belongs to the general caste and the wife belongs to OBC. So the husband is one caste above and the wife is one caste below. Which is not unreasonable because in the Indian context, actually, women are the ones who may change caste. For men, it is very hard to change caste. So it may be the case that by means of marriage, the wife can actually move one level up in terms of caste, so marry up. Okay, so you see the off-diagonal shares are not very high, but they are there, and it's a phenomenon that is slowly happening. Now, let's try to go back to the actual research question here. So is it the case that for individuals who are exposed to massive school openings when they are kids, their likelihood of marrying across castes as adults increases or not? And this is just a very simple descriptive evidence, then we'll move to the regression. But it shows you that this is the likelihood of inter-caste marriage for individuals who are exposed to a number of school openings below the median. We're just classifying below above the median here. So this is school openings below the median, and this is school openings above the median. Okay, this sort of already gives you a sense that there seems to be a difference in the likelihood of marrying across castes between school exposure groups, and we're going to further characterize these groups with an empirical specification. We're using here what is called a two-way fixed effects, becoming increasingly popular. People are now talking a lot about two-way fixed effects. We're leveraging variation in school expansion across birth cohorts within the same cluster, as well as variation in school expansion across clusters within the same birth cohort, okay? This is where the two-way fixed effects comes from. The identifying assumption is that the change in the number of primary schools in a cluster is exogenous, conditional on cluster and birth fixed effects, as well as a whole series of controls at the village level that we will include in the last specifications. And then going back to the placebo I mentioned before, one way of testing if this makes sense is to look at school openings following primary school. So primary school openings after the age of 10 should provide no benefit as the school-going age has passed, okay? So if we find that in 0 to 9 there is an effect, but following 10 there is no effect, this seems to provide some indication that the window we're looking at is a window that makes sense in terms of exposure to schooling. And this is, again, identification strategy that has been widely used, especially in economics, to study precisely supply-side shocks in school openings. Empirical investigation, I'll go quickly here. I'll just tell you that what we really care about in this specification is beta. Beta is the coefficient that we care about. And remember that post here is not the stock of schools, is the change in the number of schools between age 0 and age 9. Okay, when the man was between age 0 and age 9. So this is a change variable. Actually, I should put a delta here. This is a change in the number of schools, and beta is the causal effect, is what arguably provides the causal effect. But then you also see that we control for the stock of schools present both at birth, so when the man was born, as well as 1 year before birth, just to make sure that the context in which the man was growing up was not endogenously opening schools because potentially population was growing and so on and so forth. Okay, and then you see the two-way fixed effects here, fixed effects by birth cohort and fixed effects by village. Okay, let's look at the main results. You see here different columns. Let me tell you up front that the outcome we really care about is column 5, inter-caste marriage. But before getting into column 5, we also looked, just to test if our mechanism made any sense, we also looked at the extent to which the change in the number of schools had any effect on the total number of years of schooling of the husband, column 1, age and marriage of the husband, total number of years of schooling of the wife, age of marriage of the wife, and then inter-caste marriage. What do we see here? So we see that it makes sense that a change in the number of schools really boosted years of education for the husband. He's the one that was exposed to school openings. So being exposed to school openings really shapes the likelihood that you complete a higher number of schooling. Sorry, a higher number of years of schooling. We also observe a delay in marriage, which is interesting. We're exploring this further. We observe that being exposed to school openings really affects marriage age for husband. It delays it a little bit. We do observe also that changing the number of schools affected the years of education of the wife, which is interesting. This suggests some sort of educational assortative mating. Even if the wife was not the one who was exposed to school openings, there seems to be a mechanism, some sort of peer effect, whereby also years of schooling of the wife increased, though we do not see any change in the age and marriage of the wife, which again goes back to the idea of hybridization of family change, traditional forms versus modern. Okay. Remember, we control for the stock of schools, which is important. And going back to column 5, which is what we care about, we do observe a relatively strong and also quite high in terms of effect size impact of the change in the number of schools on the likelihood that individuals marry across castes. How do we interpret this 2.8? One way is just to interpret the raw coefficient. So 1 unit change in primary schools in a village when the husband was between ages 0 and 9 results in an increase in inter-caste marriage by about 2.8 percentage points. Many people, especially again economists, like to interpret this in standard deviation change. So in standard deviation terms, we see that 1 standard deviation change in school openings increases inter-caste marriage by about 6% of the sample mean. So this is the raw coefficient, 2.8 percentage points. If you want to convert it in standard deviation term, this translates into a 6% increase of the sample mean. Okay, now, do we observe any differences in this key impact on inter-caste marriage by caste group? The answer is really not really. Remember, the ST are the scheduled tribes, which are, first of all, low in terms of population size and scattered all around. So they really don't have much opportunity to mix across social classes and to mix across castes. So hence, it's not really surprising that among them, we don't really find any evidence of the mechanism we have in mind. But across all the other groups, scheduled caste, OBC in general, we see that the effect size is actually quite stable. If you compare these three coefficients, they're not statistically different from each other, which leads us to conclude that pretty much the effect we're documenting is universal for all caste groups in Indian society. Then we follow by conducting many other subsample analysis. We are, again, looking at analyses that are stratified by the caste of the men. So this is not a pooled analysis. This is a stratified analysis, and this seems to suggest that the strongest effects are observed among couples where the man belongs to general caste and where the man belongs to OBC caste. This is in line with the previous graph, actually, among ST. ST are the only groups among which we see a negative coefficient. What about level of education? Is it the case that this is a sort of stratified finding by level of education of the men? Not really. Here, we don't really see any evidence that there's differences by levels of education. None of this coefficient is statistically different from 0. So we should conclude that education of the husband is not really driving this phenomenon. Then we're really at a point in which we're trying to identify mechanisms. And as I've mentioned, we're not there yet at all. But so what we started to do was to include some of the mediators that I mentioned before. So we looked at this as outcomes before. These were included as outcomes. We looked at the extent to which changes in school openings affected education of the husband, education of the wife. So now we're not including them as an outcome. We're including them as a control to see if they capture anything of the overall effect. And again, the answer is really no. They're not capturing much. You see how stable the main coefficient of interest is. Even if we control for marriage age of husband, marriage age of wife, education of husband, education of wife, we remain with an effect size of 2.8 percentage points or 2.7, so incredibly stable. Now, we really want to test for contact theory. So is it the case that the schools, when you're a child, provide an opportunity for intermingling, intermixing, exposure to different cultures, exposure to different castes, exposure to different socioeconomic groups? And we don't have a direct way of testing this because we don't really have such detail about the class composition 20 years ago. We just know the kind of schools that people attended, and we know if those schools were public or private, but we don't have additional information of who attended those schools. So it's really hard for us to test for contact theory because we're leveraging data from the past. So what we did here was to say, okay, maybe private schools are more elite, while public schools should be catered to broader population groups. So if that is correct, perhaps we may expect public schools to provide a better opportunity for social mixing. And we expected, a priori, a much stronger coefficient in public schools. But you see here that it's actually not the case. We don't find, again, any difference between public and private schools. I mean, the magnitude is higher in private schools, but these two coefficients are not statistically different from each other. So the effect doesn't really differ. So we're now at a point in which we're trying to think about other ways of testing for contact theory. Then we exclude specific groups. This, again, suggests that once we exclude the scheduled tribes, our coefficient becomes much higher, which is not surprising because among scheduled tribes, our coefficient is negative. So once we exclude them, the overall coefficient becomes higher. And then we try to intersect this also with religion. So let's look at intersectionality between caste and religious groups. And what we saw is that once we exclude Hindus, our coefficient also becomes stronger. So it seems to be that the coefficient estimate that we are obtaining is mostly driven by non-Hindus. And this is something we're trying to explore now. Non-Hindus, but also non-scheduled tribes. So all the caste groups, but non-Hindus. Okay, going back to the robustness checks, I've mentioned at the beginning that doing this matching by names was very challenging because you can imagine many names are just misreported, there are spelling problems. So what we did was different robustness checks by the accuracy of matching thresholds: 50% accuracy, 60%, 70%, 80%, 90%. Of course, the higher is the matching accuracy, the lower is the sample size. Okay, so we're cutting individuals off, the higher is the matching threshold. Anyways, the point here is that irrespective of the threshold we're using, our coefficient is quite robust, still 2.7, 2.5, 2.6. Of course, once we go very high up, 90%, our sample size is incredibly low. So we still find a 0.02, 2 percentage points effect size, but it becomes weaker in terms of statistical significance because sample size is really low. What about the placebo test? So let's expose our men to changes in the number of schools after primary school. And if we do that, we should really expect these changes in the number of schools to not affect the likelihood of intercaste marriage. So this is change in number of schools when the man was 12 to 17, change in number of school when the man was 12 to 18, 12 to 19, 11 to 19, and you do see that we observe nothing. So we believe this is actually perhaps among the strongest evidence we're providing that the window we're looking at is a particularly valuable window for intercaste marriage. Okay, then I won't bother you with all of this because we're about at the end of the presentation, but especially economists are worried that school openings are not exogenous. Schools typically tend to open where there is a higher demand for school, where population is increasing more heavily, where infrastructure is either better or poorer. So if infrastructure is poorer, you want to make sure that schools may provide additional infrastructure. Anyways, in terms of geography, schools don't really open up like mushrooms. They open up based on pre-existing conditions. So what we did here was to try to look at many of these different variables using information from the census in the 1990s or retrospective censuses. And we look at demographic variables, so population growth, population size, sex ratios at birth, infrastructure, levels of infrastructure, quality of roads, educational composition of the villages at the time, and any other kind of variable that you may think can correlate with school openings at the village level. And nothing really is showing up, or better, some variables really explain the likelihood of intercaste marriage, but they don't cut the main effect of school openings. They may reduce it a tiny bit, but actually very, very little. So we believe the findings are quite robust. And I mean, I share the slide so you can look at all these controls if you're interested in. Now, where are we now? We're trying to think about additional potential threats to identification. Do we think there are other variables we haven't looked at the village level that may explain school openings? Are there any better ways of controlling for migration? Like, is it the fact that people migrate to areas where schools are likely to open? Yes, it is the case. So we're trying also to control for migration rates in the past, which is not the best, but it's the best we can do as of now. And I would say foremost, we're really a little stuck, I would say, at this point in terms of thinking about mechanisms. The way we tested for contact theory was not successful. We didn't find any real evidence that contact theory is explaining this. I think what we're really interested in is to look at school segregation patterns. So how segregated were those schools at the time when these men attended those schools? How can we measure that level of segregation? Is there an indirect way that we can use the census data we have to measure school segregation in the past? And then we're also trying to get a better sense of how we can leverage information from parents. As you recall from the literature review, I mentioned that parents are actually very instrumental, and parents' education is actually very instrumental for explaining intercaste marriage. But in the DHS, it's very hard to obtain the educational level of the parents. So we're trying to build a subsample through the household roster to get a sense of whether parents' education explains somehow what we are witnessing. And then, of course, there's lots of changes in social norms, which is, for sociologists, always the hardest thing to measure. So we're thinking about potential ways of measuring changes in social norms over this long time span. Okay, to conclude, we find that a one standard deviation change in primary school openings in a village when the man was a child results in an increase in intercaste marriage by about 6% of the sample mean. We do find some intermediate effects on years of schooling of the husband, years of schooling of the wife, and age of marriage of the husband, but not age of marriage of the wife. We find an overwhelming negative effect across all caste groups, except for the scheduled tribes. And we find that results, at least the main results, are really robust across matching thresholds, exposure windows, pre-existing conditions, and so on and so forth. And we believe that even if the overall increases in ICM are not huge, the associations we document are sizable. They can really explain a huge portion of that 4.4 percentage point increase that we document at the beginning. So contact theory remains our most plausible mechanism, but we need better ways of testing for this. But what this suggests, going back to the overall economics literature that looks at supply side school openings, is that boosting human capital early in life remains a very effective policy lever to shape even rigid family forms or institutions such as intercaste marriage. Now, you may think that increasing intercaste marriage is not a policy priority, and it's a valid claim. Many people think that caste endogamy is perfectly fine. The claim we're trying to make here is that intercaste marriage really correlates with a whole other series of good outcomes. So it should actually be perhaps a policy priority. I will stop here, and I thank you very much for your attention. I think we are good with time, 8:47 here. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your suggestion or comments or questions.
Thank you so much for a fantastic talk. We really enjoyed it. Now the floor is open for questions.
Are you reading the questions, or should I look at myself?
So I don't see any questions overall here, but maybe I'm missing something. No, please raise your hand if you have a question. Okay.
Shu has a question.
Your hand. Yes. Hushu, may I invite you to ask your question, and then Abhijit.
Thank you. Thank you for the interesting presentation. I think my main question is, I wonder why you think exposure to primary school could have an impact on intercaste marriage, because I think primary school going people, I mean, they were quite young. They were still children when they were exposed to primary school. And I think typically when we think about schools as increasing contact across groups and have an impact on assortative mating or marriage patterns, we typically look at like high school or even college. So I'm just wondering why you focus on exposure to primary school. I think the effect you have discovered in this study, I suspect maybe the primary school expansion program studied by the government is closely related to subsequent growth in, say, secondary schools. So, because for villages with increased supply of primary schools, then where do these children go, after graduation from primary school? So maybe there's a subsequent expansion of secondary school. Then this might help to explain the impact on intercaste marriage. I have a couple of minor questions too. My second question is about one particular pattern or finding in your main results. So I noticed that the number of primary schools pre-birth at village level reduces women's wives' age at marriage. And I'm quite curious by this finding. So I wonder if you have any explanation for this. And in the introduction, you talked about 85% of men in India, based on some data, have never moved. But India is also urbanizing, industrializing. So I'm just wondering how this is possible. If the migration rate is so low, then how do the cities in India grow? So I'm quite curious about that, and I wonder if you could comment on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me try to go one by one. So, yeah, I think the first question on why focusing primary school vis-a-vis other levels of education makes a lot of sense. And we had lots of discussions with my colleagues, all of whom are from India, actually. So in that sense, I can maybe blame them. But I think I had a similar observation at the very beginning, and they told me, and then I thought it made sense that, I mean, primary school, we really want to capture here the first potential contact that kids have with anyone different from their socioeconomic background. And in the sense, there is lots of literature, including psychological literature, that shows that early increasing familiarity with people different from yourself, with people different from your family background, from your parents, can really have a long-lasting effect, much more than higher levels of education, which may become, and it seems in the Indian context, do become increasingly selective. So we didn't want to be selective in this sense. And we know that many secondary schools can be selective. There's what is called tracking in education. So people start tracking more and more the higher up they go in educational attainment. So we wanted to capture a system that was not as tracked as potentially the secondary or even the tertiary school system. So I think that is the reason why we are focusing on these early ages. A combination of psychological literature that suggests the importance of these early ages, economics literature that discusses these cumulative benefits of exposure to early human capital, and a knowledge, our own knowledge of the Indian context. What about the expansion of secondary school? Yes, I think you mentioned the DPEP, the policy, and we're now at a stage in which we are trying to leverage that specific time window more heavily. So, because now we're looking at school expansion since the 1950, but then the biggest school expansion has been occurring from the 1994. And that's because we wanted to keep a long time perspective, but we can also look at a much narrower time perspective, which is precisely the one around the DPEP. We're doing those analyses now, and which again, still focus on primary school, but you're right in saying that clearly spurred an increase also in secondary schools. So that can give us a sense of cumulative or sort of fallout effects on secondary schools as well. In terms of, you mentioned one finding about the changing number of schools reducing wife-sister marriage. I confess, I don't know. I haven't noticed that, so I'll delve into that. Yeah, I think I don't have a solid answer for that, so I don't want to tell you anything that is wrong, but it's a very interesting observation that is perhaps counter to many modernization expectations we would have of schooling, delaying marriage age. And the last point was about urbanization. Yes. So yes, this data we are using allow us to filter by the share of men who have never moved. And in the DHS, that is close to 85, 87%. That is correct. So you asked about potential implications for urbanization and modernization. And again, also here, this is an interesting answer that I'm not sure I have an interesting question. I'm not sure I have an answer to, but maybe Abhijit or some people from India that I see in the chat may have a better sense of what's going on here. But I guess one of my speculation here was that perhaps in this context, migration has not been the main driver of urbanization. That's the case in many other societies. Actually, many other societies in sub-Saharan Africa are currently witnessing urbanization, not necessarily driven by migration. So I guess that's primarily the hypothesis that I may speculate on. I'll let someone else ask.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Thank you.
Abhijit, may I request you to ask your questions?
Sure. Thanks, thanks, Kriti. Luca, good to see you again. Fantastic presentation. Fabulous in terms of methodology. I think the complexity of it, I think, isn't lost on any of us. You mentioned that we may not be able to see it, but I mean, tremendous data work, really hard to do. So I'm really glad to see this paper. I just had one sort of question, which is, why look at increases in school exposure at ages 0 and older? Right? I mean, sort of, why not restrict it to the ages at which children potentially start going to school, right? I mean, because first grade, for example, would start at age 6 in most places. So did you guys think about it, and sort of why think about it 0 and older? And relatedly, sibling effects. I mean, something about, do you have data on that? I mean, at all, because your exposure to schooling as a family unit, for example, starts when your siblings start going to school, or at least out of school going age, in a sense, right? Maybe not with this data, but happy to just hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah. No, actually, I think your questions are related. Both of them are very related. Two things. Yeah, we started by saying, okay, let's just focus on the actual primary school ages, so 4 to 10, something like that. And then we said, okay, but then many people may repeat grades, many people may start school earlier, slightly later. So we said, let's try to be less stringent. And so I think we moved a little bit earlier in time to like 3 to 10 or 4 to 10. And we have all of these analyses. I haven't shown them, but we have all of these analyses, not only for the placebos, but also for the actual window. And we show that once we restrict the cutoff to the actual ages, 4 to 10, even 6 to 10, our coefficient becomes even stronger. The reason why we eventually decided to leave a broader age group was precisely because of siblings. We found in the data that the majority of men we're looking at had at least one older sibling, which means that one older sibling may have been exposed himself to school opening. So we said, well, let's try to leave 0, because that 0 to 9 allows for a short window whereby the sibling himself or herself may have been exposed to school opening, and that could have fallout effects on the men we are actually observing. Yeah, so I think that's how we're looking at siblings, but I think we can do more. I actually do think we can do more, because the DHS are much better with children's data than with their own parents' data.
Exactly.
So we can leverage household composition better than what we're doing currently. Thank you, Abhijit.
Thank you.
Mujang, may I invite you to ask your question?
Yes. Thank you very much for this very interesting talk. I actually have two quick questions. One is also about migration. And so it seems that like migration, like restricted to those non-migrant population is tend to be a major empirical decision. And so it is possible that, as you just mentioned, that it's not necessarily linked to urbanization, but I'm wondering to what extent this tendency of migration differs across different castes. And so say at the time we've seen that school expansion actually has a negative influence on inter-caste marriage on the ST. And so is that possible that it's driven by this lower migration tendency for this specific caste, and then in a way they're more excluded and they do not have other ways to integrate, and so leading them like in a way more immune to this modernization effects of school expansion. And so overall, I want to like hear more about this potential like class variations in migration. And then secondly, I thank you very much for this very elaborated, comprehensive discussion on the mechanisms how a school expansion may influence individuals' like marital attitudes and values. But I'm wondering to what extent school expansion is actually also correlated with other aggregate level social changes, right? And so, for example, this general improvement of quality of life, living conditions, development, and so on. So I guess at the end of the day, I still want to hear more about the mechanisms, right? And so to what extent is actually about these direct influences of schooling, education on like changing individuals' mindsets regarding modernization, family changes, where it's actually been a package deal, right? It's correlated with other social changes. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for this question. The first one is a very important one, the one on migration. I think at the very beginning of this, we took the easy route of simply keeping the sample of men who have never migrated. And we did that because it actually left us with the majority of the sample. So it was an empirical decision, an easy decision. But we're now trying to actually bring back everyone and trying to understand better. I mean, keep everyone in the sample and trying to understand better among those who migrated, where was there any differential migration by caste group, which is exactly what you're asking about. So let me tell you what we did so far. One small step we took in that direction, we're taking, actually, we're not there yet, is to obtain some aggregate estimates of migration rates. Let me say, so internal migration rates in India by caste group. So we are including in the main specification information on migration at the time of birth, using information from the census. And we're basically trying to control for what is the share of local migration at the time of birth that involved men who belong to ST. What is the share of internal migration of men who belong to SC? So that is, so far we have included those estimates and I haven't shown them here, and they seem to keep the main coefficient unaltered. We're trying to think about better ways to not only control for migration at the time of birth, but also migration, let's say, in this time span that we are exploring. Yeah, I wouldn't say we are there yet, but it's definitely high up on the agenda because it has come up a couple of times already, and it's a very important aspect in the Indian context. About the second question, which is about there may have been so many other social changes in this 10, 15, 20 year time period. It is correct, it is true, there have been many other social changes. From a purely empirical standpoint, the two-way fixed effects is a methodology that is precisely aimed to cut away all those possible secular changes that may have occurred in the 20 years. So by filtering away variation by birth cohort and filtering away variation by village, that intersection is precisely meant to sort of purge the estimate from anything else, let's say, yeah, anything else that may have occurred in terms of social changes in that exposure window. So from a purely empirical standpoint, I think we're relatively safe. From a theoretical perspective, I do agree with you that it's a good idea to still enrich the analysis and the discussion with an argumentation of what may have happened at a broad level in terms of changes in family forms. So we will certainly feature that into the background discussion and the whole contextualization of our results. Thank you very much for your question. Thank you.
Okay, we have Dahye next. I'm sorry we're going over time, but we have two questions and and I think we can take them. So Dahye, and then I will read out a question which is in the chat box, and then I have one suggestion as well. Dahye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll try to keep it short. I was wondering if the husbands are more positioned as marrying up or marrying down once they are benefited by opening more primary schools. And I was also thinking whether arranged marriage in India could be also an important factor to decide inter-caste marriage, right? Because if the marriage is arranged, then parents are more likely to try to find somebody in the same caste. So in that case, would you like to control for that, or is it feasible to control for that? And another very quick observation is that it's very different from the impact of higher education, actually, because literature on the impact of higher education on assortative mating they say that higher education can actually facilitate marriage homogamy, right? Because it's very highly selective education system, and only people who are willing to attend, they will attend higher education. So if you found something very drastically different from the literature, and I believe that it is true, but I was just wondering whether the probability of attending primary school is going to affect their probability of attending higher education in the end. And I think you didn't really look at the impact of higher education on your current results. So I was just wondering that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll try also to be sort of quick. The first question is about husbands marrying up or marrying down. There is evidence of both. You can see it from the contingency table. These are husbands from scheduled castes who marry with a woman who belongs to OBC. So there is evidence of both, but overall, women are slightly more likely to marry up. And this is reflected here. So these are men who already belong to the top caste marrying, and these are women from OBC. So women here in this case is 12.5% of women are women who are marrying up. And what I was saying before is that this is because in the Indian society, women are more likely to be able to move caste by means of marriage. As far as I understood, men cannot leverage marriage as a tool to marry up in terms of caste. About arranged marriage, 100%. I think this is the point we're struggling the most with. And that's again because what we would really want here is some evidence of parental control. And the DHS is not really good at providing information on adults' parents. So even just adults' parents, adults' parents' education, adults' parents' control of marriage. One thing we are trying to do now is to obtain village level information on the prevalence of arranged marriage. That's probably the best we can do to find some aggregate information that gets us at that point, because having individual level information is very complicated with the DHS on parental control. But it is probably the second biggest mechanism. If contact theory is not really showing up, there must be something about arranged marriage and parental control that is explaining most of the findings. And the third point about education, you are right, and I think that's something I should have mentioned with the previous question, that the more you go up in terms of educational attainment, the more selective educational institutions that you attend are. And the more selective the educational institutions you attend, the more likely it is that actually that selectivity translates into homogamy rather than heterogamy, right? If more people go up in education and attend schools that are selective, you're going to find a partner that pretty much has your same level of education, comes from your same social group. So I think that's actually a good point to motivate why we're looking at primary school to be a context of much broader exposure to different social groups. So we'll certainly feature that and make the point that we're looking arguably at a less selective context, which can explain why we find something different from the higher ed literature on assortative mating. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I'm going to read this question by Saurav Mondal, who says that schools are increasing with increasing population and intercaste marriage are increasing with that. So can we say for this increasing school, the intercaste marriage are increasing or connected directly?
I think the point that is being raised is that, again, school opening is a byproduct of demographic change, demographic growth, which is true, 100% correct. So what we did is to control not only for changes in population at the village level at birth and pre-birth, but also post-birth. So we actually include many control at the village level for demographic change for the first 10 years of the man's man being a child. So in that sense, we believe we are relatively safe. And if I'm not mistaken, we also control for population change when the husband is 15 once and when the husband is 20. So at different points of the husband's life course. So I think in that sense, we should be safe, but it's a valid point, definitely.
Okay, thank you. I see we're out of time. So I have just been thinking about it, and I was wondering if there is some way that we can sort of model, if you can model just distance to urban centers, right? So of course it is one thing, and the results are compelling, that we are finding that exposure to primary schools early in the life course is important for changes in marital patterns. But could it be that there is some variation to be observed, given that these changes are driven by concomitant changes in exposure to modernity in some sense, or to observing changes, and so perhaps it's worthwhile to look at where these villages are located as well. So villages that are far removed from urban centers, in remote areas. I feel that there is going to be some variation vis-a-vis those villages which are, closer to urban centers. And I'm not sure how you might model that, and maybe you'll see some different results, although it's really hard to say. And a number of people have raised questions about other forces which are influencing these changes. And I wonder if, proximity to modern areas, modern centers, urban centers could be a factor.
Yeah, I think that's a very useful suggestion, and I presume this is actually a feasible suggestion for two reasons.
Yeah.
Because if you want to have distance from urban centers, in the past we could use the census and use geographical information from the census to compute, I would say for each village, the overall average distance to urban centers. But I think this may also be useful currently. So when the union actually happens,
yes,
and that could be obtained from the DHS quite easily. I'm saying, I think that matters for urbanization in the past, but I think it also matters for the likelihood of forming an intercaste marriage right now.
yes.
So that could capture a bit of the modernization forces that are like
Right.
the backdrop of these changes. So I think that is feasible. Yes, a very helpful so that we can look at. Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't have to be this paper, because you're trying to find sort of an explanation as to.
No, I think it should be this paper, actually. I think we could definitely try that. Yeah.
Okay. So if we have no more questions, thank you so much, Luca, for being with us and for sharing this important work. We wish you all the very best, and we look forward to hosting you at CFPR.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure to get to know all of you, and I promise I will come visit soon.
Thank you
so much. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Have a good weekend.
Thank you. You too.